Welcome to the first video on Matthew Hopkins and the East Anglia Witch Hunt, 1645 to 1647. The other case study videos in a normal year are the Salem witch hunts and the southern German witch hunts within the Holy Roman Empire. Now in this video we're going to cover the who, what and the where, the causes and the preconditions, the reasons for the eventual end of the witch hunt. And you can navigate to those different sections of the video by fast forwarding and looking for the bright yellow title slide, and that makes things a bit easier for you to navigate, hopefully. Okay, so if we look at the witch hunters themselves, you can see from the information on here that we don't know that much about Matthew Hopkins. We do know that he was brought up in a strongly Puritan atmosphere. East Anglia was strongly Puritan at this time, so that's no surprise. He was literate, he could read, he could write, he was a comparatively young man, and when he died in 1647, he was very likely in his mid to early 20s, approximately 24 years old. Probably died of consumption, tuberculosis. Well, he was partnered up with someone almost as important, actually, John Sterne, who was the older man in the partnership. Like Hopkins, he'd been born in Suffolk, but he'd moved to Manningtree in Essex, and it was there that he secured the confession of Elizabeth Clark, who was the first woman to be accused as part of the East Anglian witch hunts. It was Sterne that extracted the confession from her, and Hopkins, at this point, had offered to assist Sterne in his endeavours. So it's likely that at first, the dynamic was the younger man, the older man, but Hopkins was helping out, and then gradually grew in confidence, perhaps, as the witch hunt unfolded. But part of that is speculation. Sterne is also literate. He's an intelligent man. He can read, he can write, strongly Puritan. Unlike Hopkins, he lived to a fairly respectable age and died in 1670. Now, both these men were also aided by various members of the village communities that they visited, but also by a woman called Mary Phillips. And Mary Phillips was used by the pair to examine female suspects for signs of the witch mark. More of that later on. Now, to give you a very quick overview of the witch hunt in context, if we view the witch hunt as part of a wider English phenomenon, it really sticks out because England was a very mild area for witch hunting compared to the rest of Europe. So we only executed around 500 people in the 200 years from 1500 to 1700, which is far, far less than, say, the Holy Roman Empire, in which in the same period 20,000 or more women were executed. So we really were at the mild end of the spectrum. And partly that's down to the fact that in England there was no use of torture in most witchcraft cases to secure confessions. The other big difference is that unlike in the continent, the main focus here was about maleficia, it was about harmful magic. There wasn't really any interest in the diabolical, the devilish side. So there wasn't really an established belief in a diabolical pact, and there certainly wasn't a belief in the idea of the witches' sabbat, large numbers of witches being a threat to Christian society. That just never really took off in England. Now, our witch hunting peaked at around 1580 in England. It was never that high, and certainly by the 1630s it was in a period of decline, which makes the East Anglian hunt such an outlier, because this comes at a time of decline, and yet around 250 to 300 people end up being tried as witches just in East Anglia. Over 100 are executed. That's 20% of the entire total for England for those 200 years. 20% in East Anglia over a space of 2 years. So you can see how it stands out. Like other witchcraft trials in England, these are mostly women, they are mostly poor women. Where East Anglia stands out, apart from the numbers, is you start to get much more mention in confessions of the devil. Women confess more freely to having met the devil in some way or had sexual intercourse with the devil. Now, this isn't the majority of cases, but there's many more mentions of this than in traditional witch cases in England. And that may be to do with the kind of questions that Hopkins and Stern were asking. Now, the witch hunt began in Manningtree in Essex, which you can see here. Elizabeth Clark, a one-legged old lady, was accused of being a witch by her neighbour John Rivet, whose wife was inexplicably ill. Rivet had visited a cunning woman in a neighbouring village who had said that his wife was the victim of witchcraft, and so his suspicions turned to the quarrelsome old lady that lived in the village, that was probably not very popular with her neighbours, lived on the fringes of society. She was poor, she was generally vulnerable, and it's likely that she would have relied on her neighbours for charity. Now, Clark, once John Stern got hold of her, confessed. We'll talk more about John Stern and Hopkins' methods later. And she named more women: Anne, Rebecca West, Elizabeth Gooding, Anne Leach, Helen Clark. They were all sent to Colchester and locked in the jail there. And then more women in the Colchester area were accused and subsequently locked up. Conditions in the jail were really bad. I mean, I think 4 women died whilst they were in there. Diseases were common. You would have had male jailers, so the risk of sort of physical or even sexual abuse was always there. And that in itself, although it wasn't a punishment, that would have made these women even more vulnerable and perhaps more likely to confess in order to get out. Now, more trials followed at Chelmsford. There were some hangings in Colchester, but the witch finders moved on to Chelmsford next. After the finish there, they moved on to Suffolk. Suffolk was the main centre of the East Anglian witch hunts. Bury St Edmunds, you can see from the information on the slide. What made Bury St Edmunds interesting is 2 men were executed after those trials, including the local vicar John Lowson, and we'll explore that a bit later on. And then they move around really to the other counties in East Anglia, Norfolk, Huntingdonshire, etc., etc. You can see that from the information on the slide. So if we now look more closely at who was persecuted, this is when it gets really quite interesting. England is no different in this respect to most of the witch hunts elsewhere in Europe. It is overwhelmingly female. In fact, in Essex, 90% of those accused were female. These are relatively poor women. They're at the lower end of the social economic spectrum within their village. They tend to be older. They tend to be widowed. They live alone. They're often dependent on the charity of others. Now, what's really important here is that Hopkins and Stern were not generating the accusations themselves. The accusations were coming from these people's neighbours. So John Rivet accuses Elizabeth Clark, and it's up to John Stern to secure the confession from her. So the accusations themselves are coming from below, and the witch hunters are confirming these. So that's an important dynamic to remember. Something else that's quite important is that when we look at particularly at the Essex trial records, the accusers tended to be literate members of the village community, whereas the accused tended to be illiterate. Now, that would suggest that those members of the village community doing the accusing were of a slightly higher social standing, or higher social standing than those they accused of being witches. The witches were drawn from the poorest parts of society. Now, that might suggest that witchcraft accusations were the results of village tensions and economic factors, and we'll have a look at that later. Actually, if we start with the economic situation in East Anglia, there was a long-standing crisis in England, actually, not just East Anglia, concerning land ownership. This dates back to the Tudor period, and you may remember that enclosure had been a problem in the 1500s with wealthier landowners enclosing common land that had been used by the whole community in order that they might graze livestock on there rather than growing crops. And this meant they could make more money because profit margin was bigger. It also resulted in unemployment because if you are raising cattle or sheep, you don't need as many workers. If you're growing crops, you do, to plant the seeds, harvest the crop, etc., etc. So there's this sort of long-standing problem with enclosure over the previous century, causing unemployment, which of course causes poverty and economic problems and economic tensions. A good example of this is in the Isle of Ely, which was where the last witch hunt took place in East Anglia in 1647. There was a big history of enclosure there. The local landowner was a man called Sir Miles Sandys, Sandys, and in the 1620s he had enclosed 4,000 acres of common land. Now, the people that suffered rioted in the 1630s, the poorer locals who had lost out. And it's interesting that when Hopkins visits the Isle of Ely in 1647, some of the women that are accused of being witches had been involved earlier in the rioting of the 1630s. This would indicate that they had reputations perhaps as troublemakers, or is this a case of their wealthier neighbours accusing them because they're fed up with requests of charity? Is it a case of settling scores? But it's just an interesting thing to note there. Now, if we zoom in a little bit, in 1645 and 1647, there was a really bad series of harvests, hit East Anglia particularly hard, but the whole country as well. Particularly wet summer, freezing winter, and crops rotting in the fields. It was so bad in East Anglia that farmers were reduced to, instead of planting their seed corn, to actually eating it because they didn't have enough food. So in that environment, people are looking to blame their problems on someone or something. To make matters worse, because there's a bad harvest, the price of food and other things goes up. So the price of grain goes up 12%, livestock 15%, price of bread, I think, quadruples. And inflation always hits the poorest harder than it hits the wealthier. So you get this growing disparity in communities between the rich getting richer and the poor getting poorer, because the richest people who might have had a surplus of grain, surplus of livestock, they can sell this and they're going to make more money from the high prices, whereas the poorest are losing out because prices are going up and their income isn't. Now, this would perhaps result in much more begging, more pressure on neighbours for charity. So if you've got vulnerable women who might be quarrelsome, who might have a bad reputation, they are now having to rely more on their neighbours, coming more into contact with them, and potentially this causes tension. And we'll talk about the charity refused model a bit later on, but all of these things create an environment in which accusations can perhaps flourish. So this is the charity refused model here. This is the idea that Keith Thomas and Alan McFarlane pioneered in the 1970s. Their argument was that a lot of these cases followed the same kind of pattern. An elderly, vulnerable woman asks her wealthier neighbour for charity. She's refused, or she doesn't get enough. She walks away cursing. The wealthier neighbour remembers this, feels guilty perhaps. Then the wealthier neighbour experiences some kind of bad luck, an illness in the family, perhaps a death, could be anything, and attributes this to the mean old woman. Starts to suspect witchcraft. The gossip network in the village goes into overdrive. Turns out other women have got similar suspicions. These might have been going on for years. And as a result, the poor old crone is accused of being a witch. Now, all of these economic problems are made worse by the civil war that's being fought in England at this time. It's made worse because there's more demand for everything, which fuels more price rises. These counties in East Anglia are part of what's called the Eastern Association, and they support Parliament and not the king, the forces of Parliament. So the parliamentary army is confiscating horses from this area, which are very important animals. They are also, from 1643, levying a new tax on the Eastern Association, on the Eastern counties, to meet the increasing costs of war. So everything seems to be making the poorest in society worse off. All of those problems are made worse. Now, this is not an open and shut case, because a lot of these problems with inflation, bad weather, these are not just happening in East Anglia, they're happening in other parts of the country too. They're happening in Kent, they're happening in Sussex. What you're not getting is an explosion in witchcraft accusations. So this on its own is not enough. And there had been problems with bad harvests and lack of food and price rises all the way through the Middle Ages as well, and yet there were no resultant witch hunts. So this on its own may be a contributing factor, but these socio-economic reasons are not a sufficient cause, if you like, of the witch hunt. So what other causes were there? Well, there was a religious situation, and East Anglia is a highly Puritan area. Now, Puritans are, or were, also called Calvinists. They believed in an extreme form of Protestantism, a very morally serious, strict form of Protestantism. They looked at the Church of England, the Anglican Church, and they felt it hadn't gone far enough, that it needed to be stricter. Now, Puritans have certain views about the world. The first of these was that idleness, not working, so begging, being dependent on others, perhaps, being a vagrant, that kind of thing. Idleness is seen as sinfulness. You know, the devil does make work for idle hands and all that. The other thing that Puritans believed in was the idea of trying to establish a godly commonwealth, particularly in this East Anglian area, but for England more widely. They absolutely reject the forces of the king, King Charles I. They see him and his Archbishop Laud, or Loud, depending on your pronunciation, L-A-U-D, as being far too Catholic in their beliefs. Now, neither of these men were Catholic, but they did lean towards more decoration in churches and perhaps more colourful robes and ceremony. They categorically were not Catholic, but the Puritans, who were very strict, see them as being very papal, very Catholic leaning, and they reject this, and they want this moral purity, this religious purity. They want to root out all superstition that could be vaguely Catholic. So they hate the king, and they hate his archbishop, and they are firmly on the side of Parliament in the Civil War. Now, in 1643 and 1644, Parliament appoint an iconoclast general. This is an official title for a man called William Dowsing. He visits East Anglia and he goes around, partly at the request of the different villages of Puritans, to root out any remaining Catholic superstition, any pictures, statues, stained glass, that kind of thing. And these things are destroyed, they're burnt, as you can see in the picture, or smashed. And he's a huge hit with the Puritans. Notice the name, Iconoclast General. Hopkins later on calls himself the Witchfinder General. The difference is Hopkins had no official recommendation from Parliament. This was a self-proclaimed title of the Witchfinder General, but perhaps this is where he gets the idea for the name. So later on, it's interesting that Sterne and Hopkins get a warm reception and are even invited to the same villages that earlier on had shown this Puritan desire to purify and get rid of any Catholic superstition. They're invited to the same places because that urge to purify is now being turned against witches. Now, as a result of this very strong Puritan belief in this area, the people in charge in the local areas tends to change a bit. So local priests that aren't Puritan enough are forced out of their posts during the Civil War. The justices of the peace, the sort of local magistrates, if they're not Puritan enough, they are also forced out of their posts by the locals. Now, these people tended to be quite moderate. These were the people that in the 1630s had overseen, if you like, the decline of witchcraft accusations, and now they're being replaced by Puritans who have a much stronger urge to purify society and purge society. So that might be a contributing factor here. Now, Puritans also believed in the end of days. They believed that the world was eventually going to come to an end, and the return of Christ would lead to a huge battle, Judgment Day, between the forces of evil and the devil and Christ, and that if this was coming, that the devil was already active, and his agents of evil were already active within the world. And Parliament sort of tapped into this, really. They in their propaganda, they labelled King Charles as being far too Catholic, and said that was because he was an agent of the devil, an agent of Satan. So there was this combination of factors which create this growing fear of evil forces in the world and the devil. And so it's not a big leap to start persecuting witches in that kind of situation. They also thought that the bad weather they'd been having was perhaps the result of punishment from God. This is another Puritan belief that God will punish you in lots of different ways if you are not sufficiently strongly religious. Okay, now, is that enough on its own? Well, it might not be. The other thing that makes these witchcraft accusations more possible and means that they go somewhere and turn into a witch hunt is that the Civil War has led to a total breakdown in the legal system. So the assize system, which was a really good system of justice, where you would have highly trained assize judges dispatched from London, and they would twice a year go on a different circuit around the country. They'd be responsible for different counties, and they would visit these counties and then oversee serious cases for serious crimes. Well, the assize judges could not reach East Anglia. There was no fighting going on in East Anglia, but London was cut off because of fighting, and so it was too unsafe really for them to travel to East Anglia. So in the absence of the assize judges, you had in East Anglia in the witch trials much more reliance on local magistrates who are less well trained. They are much less experienced in dealing with serious cases. And not only that, they're local. So they are tied up in the local gossip, in the local superstitions, in local tensions between people. They are more a part of that community. Whereas the assize judges were more likely to be fair and above all of that because they were coming from London and they weren't local. So in the early stages of the witch hunt in Colchester, the brilliantly named Harbottle Grimston is the local magistrate, and he is, unlike an assize judge, he is much more willing to investigate witches, perhaps, and he's much more willing to give John Stern and Matthew Hopkins powers to operate in his area. And not surprisingly, there are women executed at Colchester. Now, when the witch finders go to Chelmsford, instead of an assize judge, they are in contact with the Earl of Warwick, who is not legally trained at all, really, and as a result, 19 women are executed at Chelmsford. Now, would it have happened with an assize judge? Maybe not. Now, the problem was they're less experienced, these local magistrates, and they tended also to rush these cases. These cases were conducted at tremendous speed, and women were put on trial in batches. And it could be that because of that, the speed and the way it's done, that the evidence perhaps wasn't considered as carefully as it might be. So all of these things contribute. Now, in this vacuum of legal expertise, in the vacuum created by a lack of assize judges, Hopkins has set himself up as an expert, witchfinder general, and perhaps his local magistrates, feeling a bit out of their depth, are grateful that a supposed expert can help them. Now, nice synoptic link for you here. We've seen this before. If there's a breakdown in a legal system, it can lead to a witch hunt. Now, in France, in the Champagne-Ardenne region, in 1587, so earlier than this, there was a breakdown in judicial authority. So the locals had taken things into their own hands much more, and they believed that they were witches, and they were doing all kinds of ridiculous swimming tests to see if they floated, etc., etc. Women were being executed without trial. Um, and this witch hunt did not come to an end until the higher court, the Paris Parliament, which had authority over the area, restored order, and that was a sort of equivalent of the assize judges, really. So we can see if the locals are allowed to take matters into their own hand without a central legal authority overseeing things, you can get abuses. Now, if we look at the Holy Roman Empire, there's lots of little states, and they're part of an empire, but actually they quite often ignored those higher imperial courts, and there were abuses in these smaller states as well. They sort of went their own way. They used excessive torture to secure confessions, and you had the same outcome, really. If there's no higher court providing a right of appeal, if there are no higher judges to check that everything's being done properly, then you get abuses. So what did those abuses look like when it came to Hopkins and Stone? Well, um, both these men were experts at securing confessions, and they did this in a number of ways. The most common way was to keep the suspected witch awake. Now, these are mainly old women, in Elizabeth Clark's case, one-legged. So they were kept awake for nights on end, and they were walked around the room or hopped around if you were Elizabeth Clark. Now, I'm making a joke here, but this is really, really dreadful stuff. This would be classed as torture nowadays, and it would lead to, women ending up in a sort of almost dreamlike state in between wakefulness and sleeping. And when you're that tired, you will pretty much admit to anything that's suggested to you. The other way they secured confessions was just by rough handling. I mean, if you've got an elderly, vulnerable woman and you're shoving her around the whole time, that has an effect as well. But also keeping them isolated, where they would sort of be left alone for hours and hours and hours, dwelling on things, perhaps feeling guilty, and this would lead sometimes even to a mental breakdown. Now, the other way in which Hopkins and Stern got convictions is they used the idea of familiars, which were popular in other English witchcraft cases. They said that witches might associate with a diabolical animal, and in return for suckling from a witch's teat or a witch's mark, this familiar or animal would give them powers and help them do their magic stuff. And so they would use watchers, sometimes local people from the villages, to sit up with the women for signs of the familiar. And if a woman is sleep deprived, she might hallucinate at this point, or that a bug or a spider or a fly might come into the room, and a watcher would seize on this as evidence of a familiar. Similarly, these witches' marks that Hopkins and Stern said was proof of witchcraft could be sort of pretty much any mark on your body, and people were covered in marks and spots and boils and warts and and freckles, and it could be just about anything that might be a witch's mark. Now these marks were supposed to be numb to pain, and Hopkins had a special knife that he would use, a blunt knife, to sort of cut a witch's mark, and if it didn't bleed, this was evidence that it was a witch's mark. But whilst you're searching for these witches' marks, of course, you might be jabbing them with a pin or a knife. So there's going to be all of these bits that are painful that then aren't your witch's mark, and they continue to search. And so this is a form of torture as well, isn't it? Really. So you can see why women would be more likely, perhaps, to confess. Now, it's this use of torture, and it is torture, that also produced large-scale hunts in parts of Europe. England, remember, with its tradition of not using torture, very mild in comparison. As soon as you start to get what is effectively torture used in East Anglia, you get more hunts, because women are confessing and perhaps also pointing the finger at others. Okay, now there was opposition to Hopkins and Stern. There's always been in this country, and always since the beginnings of the witch hunt as well, there'd always been a tradition of skepticism. But by the time we get to 1645, a parliamentary newspaper, sort of news sheet stroke a propaganda paper, the Moderate Intelligencer, which was published in East Anglia, was expressing doubts about some of the activities of the witch hunters. The Parliament itself intervened and pardoned 9 of the Essex women for witchcraft. And what's implied there is that Parliament was saying this evidence is dodgy. This evidence is not robust enough, and that tells you that perhaps his local magistrates are not doing as good a job as they might. Also, you've got open criticism of the witch finders, which would be quite dangerous actually, because you don't want to be accused of being in league with the devil yourself, or being a witch yourself. So a clever criticism that people used was they said, well, they seem to find these witches so effectively, it's almost inexplicable how good they are at finding witches. Perhaps there's a supernatural explanation for this ability. So they're sort of accusing them of being supernatural, if you like, being in league with the devil, perhaps. John Gall is a Huntingdon preacher, and he is, I think it's fair to say, slightly more moderate in his Puritan beliefs, but he accuses Hopkins of being like the Catholic inquisitors in Germany who go looking for witches. So the criticism starts to grow, but it doesn't stop the witch hunt. So what does? Well, it's probably a combination of these two factors, really. The witchcraft trials were expensive. If you were going to get the witch finders to come and help, you had to pay their expenses, you had to pay them a fee on top of that. If you're locking people up, like in Colchester, you have to pay for the jail. Trials are expensive. There were all kinds of fees. You had to feed the jury, for example. If you executed someone, you had to pay for the gallows to be built. If you're going to have them hanged, you had to pay for the rope. You had to pay an executioner. You can't just get any Tom, Dick and Harry to do it. You then had to pay to have the victim buried. And there's all kinds of costs that are that come out of this, the judicial process. Now in Ipswich, they had to levy a new tax about 1645, I think, to meet the costs of the witchcraft trials that they'd had to deal with. So that could be one reason. The other reason I think is possibly more important is the return of the assize system. Now, by 1647, the fighting in the Civil War has pretty much come to a stand. It kicks off again a bit later on, but that's a different story. And the assize judges return, and they return to Norfolk, and it's here that Hopkins and Stern start to get criticised by the assize judges. And in response to that, Hopkins wrote this, The Discovery of Witches, and you can see it's delivered to the judges of assize for the county of Norfolk. He's justifying his actions. And this is a sign, isn't it, that perhaps the assize judges themselves have got higher standards of evidence. They're a bit more sceptical about the whole thing. They're not tied up with these local tensions that lead to accusations. So perhaps their calmer heads are prevailing there. And the other reason that this comes to an end is, of course, that Hopkins dies in 1647, and without this self-proclaimed witchfinder general, perhaps there is less of a need to pursue witches. Okay, so how do we conclude this, really? Malcolm Gaskell's probably one of the foremost experts on this. He says Hopkins and Stern were not the commanders-in-chief of the witch hunt. They're the catalysts. They speed up a reaction that's already going. They gave the accusers confidence by confirming their suspicions and beliefs. James Sharp, also a bit of an expert on this, says it's obvious that Hopkins could only have initiated mass witchcraft trials if there was popular enthusiasm for them. And I think that's the case. There was popular enthusiasm for them in these Puritan areas. So if we take these things, the activities of the witchfinders, the tensions in village communities that led to accusations, the appetite for purifying society, and then the absence of a centralized legal system, we've got a fairly good set of ingredients for a witch hunt to happen. Okay.